GD802 Flower Photography with Duncan Heller. First, a note to students with point-and-click cameras. If you're using a compact digital camera, then not much of this lecture applies to you until you're ready to jump to a more flexible camera system with interchangeable lenses, such as a DSLR camera. Macro photography. Macro lenses come in a range of between 50 and 210 mm, depending on type and manufacturer. So what is the difference? Well, essentially, it comes down to the working distance and depth of field. Almost 90% of my flower photography is done with just two lenses. My 100mm macro and my 180mm macro. And we will spend the first part of this lesson looking at the equipment. There is also a 50mm and a 65mm macro lens, but these are not as common. So what is macro photography? Well, it's loosely defined as any photograph that is made very close up, where you'll be filling the frame with your subject. From a more technical viewpoint, one might consider true macro photography begins when you're photographing objects at life size, or larger than life size. That is, a scale of 1:1. Consider these lenses just as normal lenses for the moment. A 50mm lens will have more depth of field than a 100mm lens, as we learnt in the previous lesson. With a 50mm lens, you may have trouble getting your background out of focus, as it's almost considered a wide-angled lens. Also, the subject will not be as large with a 50mm macro, so to make it larger, you'll have to move in closer, and as a result, this can cause you to block the light on your subject, creating shadows. If you photograph a subject at the same working distance with a 100mm or 105mm, or even a 180 or 200mm lens, your longer lens will have less depth of field, and your subject will be larger in the frame. The most commonly used macro lens is the 100 or 105mm range. These typically have a 1:1 or life-size magnification ratio. For 35mm users, or those with a full-frame chip, this means that a 1-inch subject will be 1 inch in your image. Many short macros, for instance the 50mm macro, will only give you a half life-size image, and therefore potentially could be perceived as not a true macro lens. Digital photographers. Those using a digital SLR, which is not a full-frame chip, will have an increased lens factor to consider. So a 100 or 105mm macro lens will actually be 160 or 168mm on a camera with a 1.6 magnification factor because of the chip size. A subject that is 1 inch will still be 1 inch if you stay at the same working distance. However, that 1 inch will fill the frame. In fact, it'll overfill it. Things appear larger because you're recording onto a card that has a smaller format than the 35mm film or full-frame chip. This can work to your advantage in getting bigger images of smaller things. Extension tubes. These are hollow tubes with no glass optics that extend or push the lens away from the film plane or digital sensor. This extension causes optical changes that allow you to focus closer, which in turn magnifies the image in your viewfinder. They can be used on almost any lens that works with your camera system, which makes them very versatile accessories. I have used an extension tube on a 500mm lens to focus closer when photographing birds at nest, and when trying to photograph close-up detail of tree bark, I needed my 70 to 200mm and an extension tube. Extension tubes can even turn a zoom labelled macro into a more powerful lens. Several companies make extension tubes that will electronically link your camera system so you can continue to meter and have automatic functions. Or you can buy your camera's own brand, if made. I recommend Kenko makes a set of extension tubes which gives you maximum flexibility in combining various tubes together. The further away you push the lens with an extension tube, the more light has to travel to reach the sensor or film, so you lose light in the form of f-stops or shutter speed. What may have been f8 at 125th of a second exposure might now become f5.6 or f4, or keeping the same aperture, your shutter might slow down to 1/60th or even 1/30th of a second. How much light you lose depends on the length of the extension, but since the light meter functions normally with the extension in place, you'll see the change through your viewfinder. The downside is that slow shutter speeds make macro photography challenging if there's any wind. And wider apertures can make it challenging if you want the subject more in focus. But all in all, they are very versatile accessories to have in your camera bag. Diopters, often called close-up filters or close-up lenses. These screw-in attachments for the front of your lens turn any lens they fit into a closer focusing lens. They look like little magnifying glasses. In effect, that's exactly what they are. How much closer you can get depends on the optical strength of the diopter lens and what lens you're using. Diopters come in various powers. Less expensive diopters are often simply labelled as 1+, 2+, etc., whereas the more top quality diopters have a different naming method. For example, the 250D from Canon has a power of 2 times magnification. Diopters are designed as a single or double element. Single element diopters are much less expensive, but they generally do not provide top quality results. For many just beginning in macro photography, they will work fine, but for the best quality, you'll want to use the double element diopters. The main asset of diopters is that they don't cause any light loss when using them. This means you have more control over the motion from breezes and greater control over keeping your depth of field. The cons are that there aren't any. In my opinion, they're an essential close-up accessory for me, and I never go into the field without one. Extension bellows. These are accordion-pleated accessories that serve the same function as extension tubes. They are glassless, and they can expand. They push the lens mount on the front of them further away from the sensor or film, thereby allowing the lens to focus closer. By being able to focus closer, you will get a larger image. The extension bellows fit onto the camera, and the lens then fits onto the end of the extension bellows. Pros. One asset of bellows extensions is that it provides continual, smooth extension, as they're geared, unlike the fixed sizes of any one extension tube. Cons, well, just like extension tubes, they cause light loss, and most of them do not work automatically with your light meter. This makes them slow to work with and dark to see through. Once a great option, but now not so great option unless you buy one that hooks into your camera's electronics. Teleconverters. Teleconverters fit between the camera and the lens, but unlike extension tubes, they have glass elements that magnify the picture. They come in two sizes, the 1.4 times magnification and the 2 times extender. Pros. They're very useful for increasing the zoom of your lens. For instance, the 2 times doubling the range of a lens. For example, a 200mm lens becomes a 400mm lens. The cons is that you use one stop of light with the 1.4 converter and 2 stops of light with the 2 times converter. Other accessories that make macro photography easier. Builders' knee pads. Any type of knee pad that builders use will not only save your wardrobe costs for wear and tear on your jeans, but they'll also save your knees. Water-resistant or waterproof ground cloth. The more time you spend bending down, getting those dew-covered flowers and grasses, the wetter you're going to get. So having a waterproof ground sheet is a very useful tool. Focusing rails. These wonderful gadgets attach to your tripod and to the camera and allow the camera to smoothly increment and move forward or backwards in fine degrees for focusing on your subject. Right-angled viewfinders. After hours of working on your stomach or low to the ground with your tripod, you'll understand why a right-angled viewfinder can save the day and your neck. These handy accessories attach to your viewfinder of your SLR camera and allow you to look from above rather than flat on. Macro flashes. There is the ring light style and the small twin light flash bracket. This class of flash is designed to be used mostly in natural daylight for macro images of flowers and insects, but is quite specialist equipment and therefore quite expensive to buy. Okay, now that we've had a general summary of information on close-up equipment, you're ready to begin working in flower photography. You will find yourself looking at a world from a knee-high perspective, or even worse, going down on everything around you, in the nicest possible way. You might find that flowers you buy for the kitchen table turn into photo experiments, and the artichokes you plan for dinner suddenly become very interesting photographically. In fact, you might even find yourself buying vegetables you don't like just because you have the photo potential. So let's talk about light. Direct light versus diffuse light. Why is it that so many wonderful flower images seem to be photographed under soft lighting conditions when what we often see, what we want to photograph, is in sunlight? The answer has to do with the amount of contrast in the photo. Film has never been able to deal with large ranges of light and dark that our world often presents. In the last lesson, we learned that the human eye can distinguish about 16 stops of light, while film cameras only 4 to 5, and digital cameras maybe 6 to 7 with some manipulation. What our eyes see as being normal, for example 16 stops of light, the camera condenses down to a maximum of 7 stops making the shadows look darker and the highlights look brighter. So strong contrast in a picture is a big problem with macro photography. One of the ways round this is to use what's known as a diffusion disk. Diffusion disks block the direct sunbeams and scatter them, making the light more broad and non-directional. That softer quality of light produces softer shadows, and it makes photographing details of nature and other subjects much more rewarding. Diffusion disks come in a variety of sizes, with 12 to 36 inches being the most usable size for close-up work. You'll see them described as either translucent or silk, and there is a difference. The silk allows double the amount of light through it than a translucent allows. You can control the intensity of the light through the diffusion disk. If you place the disk too far away from your subject, it scatters the light so much of it is simply blocked out, like thick cloud cover, and therefore creates a rather flat, uninteresting light. But if you move it closer to your subject, you can see the light becoming more intense and more directional, even though it's still diffused. Some of the best flower photos I've ever taken are on cloudy days. The cloud acts like one big diffusion disk. It's best when it's not too thick, so the light will still have some direction to it, while remaining diffused. The best light for capturing this rain-splattered lupin leaf was the overcast light from clouds, which allows you to see more of the leaf detail while still reflecting highlights in every drop, adding that sparkle to the image needed. Another option is to use the white umbrella. These also can be great for creating diffused light and are relatively inexpensive. A larger golf-size umbrella gives you working room under it, while with the smaller ones, you and your camera setup might not fit too comfortably. There are several types of diffusion tent, which are also on the market. These not only allow you to work with diffused light, but also act as a windbreak. Sometimes, even with diffused light, you'll still need to add a little bit more light into the shadow areas. A good way to do this is to use a small piece of white card or a reflector that you can bounce light back onto these areas. A 12-inch white reflector disc is also great for this purpose. Maximizing focus and controlling depth of field. We can work very hard to get the most depth of focus in our images and still not have as much as we would want. The closer you get to your subject with any lens, the less depth of field you'll have. But in macro work, you're often dealing with only millimeters of depth. There are two common methods for macro photography. Method A, what I'll call the scientific method, is where you record your subject as sharply as possible. Method B, the interpretive method, wherein you create an impression of your subject as an artistic expression of what you're seeing. The trick is, in order to maximize the depth of field you get, you'll want to align your film plane or sensor plane as parallel as possible to your subject. That way, you'll maximize the perceived depth of field. When photographing this colourful pattern of leaves, I wanted as much depth as possible to be certain the secondary level of leaves in the pile were as sharp as the top ones. I position myself directly over the leaves, pointing the lens straight down. Tripods and other supports. Tripods are necessary when you're trying to get everything sharp and nicely composed in your macro images, but many of them can't get us low enough to the ground to be effective. If you're considering purchasing a new tripod and think you'll be doing a lot of macro work, buy a model with no center column at all, or one that goes flat to the ground with all three legs. Make sure you don't buy a tripod with a connecting brace to each of the legs. Even if they disconnect, you usually can't get low enough with this type of tripod. A super clamp, made by Bowden, attaches any leg to your tripod, and then with the thread stud you can mount your tripod head to this clamp and use your camera in any position at any height along the leg of the tripod. Tabletop tripods. Tabletop tripods with a medium-sized ball head allow you to work closely in and get pretty low to the ground. There's also one called a GorillaPod, which is the one you can see on the right-hand side. This allows you to attach the camera to any surface, and it will help cling and hold the camera in place. Beanbags are also useful as an alternative to a tripod. When filled, this bag can cradle your camera or lens setup and position you really low to the ground. It can be hard to keep the exact framing of focus on the lens when the camera settles into the beanbag sometimes, but it's a great and affordable option for low angle or just for every other type of photography. One good tip is, the closer the background objects are to your foreground subject, the more they'll be in focus. When selecting subjects to photograph in the field, try to find ones that have some distance between them and the background elements, in order to create a very blurred background feel. If setting up a macro image on your patio table, position your subject to be as far away from anything behind it, so you can keep it out of focus. In this shot of a tulip, you can see the blue colour in the background, which is out of focus, was in fact a porcelain blue sphere as a piece of sculpture, but works well in this photograph to add a little bit of colour and interest. This photograph of a cactus was taken in the studio with a white background using studio lighting. This poppy was taken in the field in the evening with the light shining almost directly towards me, which highlighted all these tiny little hairs on the stem of the flower. This next poppy shot is actually called a slide sandwich. With old film cameras, it was possible to take more than one shot on the same piece of film. Today, Nikon cameras have the ability to do this in camera, while the rest of us will have to create this effect in Photoshop. Keeping it simple. With macro photography, in general, there's usually one thing or one area that you want us to see the most. I chose to position this leaf in the bottom third of the picture, a little to the left, to place it in what we would call the power position of the grid. the grid is very useful in composition. The power lines represent the lines of the grid. The horizontal power lines should be used for horizons, either the bottom third, if there's not much foreground interest, or the top third, if there's not very good cloud. With the vertical lines and the intersections between the two lines, these are the most powerful points and are excellent for placing subjects within the photograph, within the frame. What happens if you have more than one subject in your macro scene, such as 2 leaves or 3 flowers? These 3 morning glories create a nice triangle between their glowing centres. With the sunflower picture, I want you to travel the pathway to the petals to get to the centre of the blossom. When you enter the picture in the upper left, you jump onto those petals and slide down to the brown area of the sunflower. Another important rule is to make sure you fill the frame with your subject. This photo on the left has some rather uncomfortable blank spaces, whereas this photograph on the right is exactly the same composition, but here I've moved closer to the subject and therefore filled the frame, and it's made a much more satisfying composition. How to stop wind movement. Wind is one of the main enemies of the flower photographer. Any of you who've tried macro photography already know that wind can be your worst enemy in the field. When in close, with the kind of magnification we have, movement is very apparent, even when slight. There is a tool called the McClamp, a great accessory to help you control the breeze. Well, it actually helps you control the movement of your flower by holding the flower still while you photograph it. Creating abstract close-ups. There isn't a whole lot to say about this, because this type of photography is a lot about experimentation and learning to see more deeply. But here are a few ideas and thoughts that will help you begin to think abstractly. When you get in really close and focus just on the edge of small areas of a subject, what you will see is that you have a very narrow depth of field, and that only one small plane of your subject will be in focus, with the rest of it a soft blur, where highlights and shadows can blend together, and colours can become washes and hues. working this close and hand holding, the best way to focus is to set the lens on the minimum focus and rock your body forwards and backwards to bring what you want sharp into focus. Zooming while using a slow shutter speed creates some very interesting effects and is worth experimenting, and I would recommend setting the camera to approximately 1/4 of a second and setting the zoom lens to maximum and then zooming out. Another very effective in-camera photograph is to smear Vaseline onto a UV filter which is screwed to the end of your camera lens. This gives a very dreamy effect, but it's very important to always use a filter and never to smear Vaseline onto the end of the lens itself. Here are some other photo effects. The top left is again a slow shutter speed, and the camera is actually moved vertically up and down while taking the photograph. Top right, the camera is spun round as you're taking the photograph. Bottom right, this is a zoom shot, and bottom left is a Vaseline shot. Top left is a photograph of a tulip with a very small depth of field. Top right is a zoom shot of an acer tree in autumn. Bottom left is a photograph of a tree peony in a studio and then converted to black and white. And bottom right is the same tree peony but on a white background and lit from both bottom and top to give a see-through, almost X-ray effect. If you're into flower photography, one lens you might be interested in purchasing is called a Lens Baby. This produces some very interesting photographs, as it blurs quite a lot of the shot and only allows one small area to be in focus. All these last shots were taken with a Lens Baby and can give you some very beautiful ethereal looks. And finally, to end with, one of my favourite flower photos. This is a sunflower taken with a hint of Vaseline on a lens, which gives this very beautiful ethereal look to the photograph.